The theme of wealth and poverty is absolutely central to Charles Dickens' novella A Christmas Carol. But the question is, how and why is it used in the story? Let's find out. How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video we are going to think about how the related themes of wealth and poverty are presented in Charles Dickens' novella A Christmas Carol by thinking about some key contextual information, looking at several key quotations, and of course analysing them as well. Hopefully, something I say or write in this video will help you out as you study or revise Dickens' classic Christmas tale. As ever, I strongly recommend that you have something to take notes with as you watch this video, because I will be saying quite a bit. Also, if you do think that anything I go over in this video is helpful, please do consider giving it a like, dropping it a comment, sharing it with anyone else who you think might find it helpful, and of course, subscribing to my channel if you aren't already. I know saying all of that stuff is super cringy, but it really does help me out loads, so thank you in advance. Now, I've said that this video is about wealth and poverty, which is great, but what is meant by that? Well, simply put, this video is about money, about having lots of it or very little of it. When an exam board asks you to write about wealth and poverty, then they want you to write about the effects of being rich or poor and what characters with different amounts of money are like. As such, most of this video is going to be about money in some way, shape or form, as well as social inequality and perhaps also class differences as well. Way towards the end though, I will be throwing a curveball your way. So make sure you watch all the way through to see some real outside of the box thinking from me. Anyway, if I have established what I mean by wealth and poverty, what historical information can we use in order to inform our understanding of it in Dickens' Victorian tale? Okay, so some important contextual knowledge for us to first acknowledge is that the Industrial Revolution, which of course took place in the Victorian era, triggered greater wealth disparity and class difference. Technological advances transformed how factories and businesses operated and generally meant that they could produce more and therefore make more money. Because of this, business owners who would have of course belonged to the middle and upper classes became wealthier. In order to run their businesses though, business owners required people to do the labour-intensive jobs. Now they did find a willing supply of workers among the working class, many of whom moved to the cities from rural areas looking for a better quality of life and, simply put, more money. Business owners though paid their employees poorly because there were no legal trade unions in the early part of the Industrial Revolution to prevent them from doing so. Furthermore, business owners made their employees work in pretty unfavourable conditions. As such, the population of Britain's cities changed quite radically. Not only did they grow quite significantly, but the rich got quite a bit richer and there was a mass influx of poor workers. In fact, the middle and upper classes only amounted to about 15% of the British population during the Industrial Revolution, leaving the remaining 85% to the poor working class. For every person who was, at the very least, financially comfortable, there would be 5 or 6 people for whom day-to-day life was incredibly difficult. Whereas the rich might live in opulent houses and hire servants, the working classes lived in poor conditions, sometimes cramming their large families into only 1 or 2 rooms. Suffice to say, the difference between being wealthy and being poor was more prominent than ever. Another important thing for us to consider is that the 1834 Poor Law transformed how the poor were treated in society, but, sadly, for the worse. Before the 1834 Poor Law, local councils supported the poor by taxing the middle and upper classes. However, the amount required to support the poor increased each year simply because there were more and more poor people to look after as the demand for workers increased as the Industrial Revolution progressed. The middle and upper classes resented having to pay for the poor and complained and complained and complained. Now, this eventually prompted the creation of the 1834 Poor Law. In essence, this saw the middle and upper classes being taxed, but at a lower rate than before, and this money was used to set up workhouses, which were colloquially seen as prisons for the poor. Now, workhouses were pretty grim places. Families were often broken up, the people in them were given bland, barely sufficient food to eat, and were forced to work long hours doing incredibly monotonous and physically intensive jobs. Admittedly, people in the workhouses were clothed, fed, given occasional access to bathing facilities, and were given shelter, but quite rubbish shelter at that. And children were given some form of education, but these places were far from pleasant. The workhouses were more of a deterrent than a safety net, a place so terrible that the working class were determined to avoid ever having to go to one. Charles Dickens's family, as I'm sure you know, spent some time in a workhouse during the author's childhood, and so he would have been well aware of just how awful they were. Now, the wealthy generally had a pretty poor view of the working class. Thinking that the poor were poor just because they were too lazy or drunk to work was not an uncommon opinion to hold. Now, this negative opinion of the poor can also be seen in Thomas Malthus's ideas about population growth, which were prominent at the time in which Dickens was writing. Simply put, Malthusian theory states that the more natural resources that a society has, which of course happened during the Industrial Revolution, the higher the population of that society will grow. At the moment, that sounds quite normal, right? But here's the thing. Malthus theorized that this population growth would always exceed the ability to produce more resources, and so there would never be enough to go around, basically meaning that there would be too many people and not enough stuff, which is more or less the basic condition of poverty. Now, rather than suggesting measures to improve the amount of resources available to everyone, or suggesting a fairer distribution of them, Malthus instead advocated methods that decreased what might be seen as the surplus population. He supported the idea of abstinence and the restriction of parenting rights for undesirable, in his words, individuals. And also, he wasn't against the idea of disease, starvation, and war as methods of reducing the population. Now, I don't know about you, but this Malthus guy doesn't sound so great. Dickens certainly did not like his ideas and wrote against them several times in his writerly career, not least in A Christmas Carol. The final bit of context that I would like to acknowledge is that as much as there was a massive wealth disparity in the Victorian age, and as much as the wealthy generally did look down on the poor, there were charities in place, and some wealthy individuals, including Dickens himself, did what they could to support the poor. But the thing is, their efforts were insufficient. Poverty was just far too great in the Victorian era. It wasn't something that could be solved by a few generous individuals, but was instead something that the whole of society needed to take responsibility for. Alright, I appreciate that that was quite a bit, but hopefully it has given you a more solid understanding about how wealth and poverty were present in Victorian society. Now that I've done all that, let's look at some quotations. Yeah? Okay, so this theme video is going to be slightly different than the others that I have made in this series. We've got a lovely little quadrant going on here, and it is something that I've put into place because I think it will help us to break down this complex theme into more manageable chunks. So first of all, we're going to think about negative presentations of wealth in A Christmas Carol. Alright, if you've watched any of my other videos in this series, you know what I'm going to say here. all of the page references that will appear on screen over the course of this video relate to this copy of the book. Now, our page numbers, they're going to be slightly different if you've got a different copy of the story, but hopefully I still make them relatively easy enough to locate for you. Now, our first two quotations come from when Scrooge speaks with the charity representative in Stave 1. Early in his dialogue, he asks, "Are there no prisons? And the union workhouses? Are they still in operation?" And then later on he asserts, "If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population." But what can we say about this in relation to the theme of wealth and poverty? Well, Scrooge's dialogue makes it clear that he is in favour of the 1834 Poor Law and also that he holds Malthusian views. But the way he expresses these views, asserting that the poor should just die and calling them surplus as if they are just a statistic rather than people, is absolutely abhorrent, inhumane and heartless. By presenting such views in a negative way, it is clear then that Dickens is criticising both the Poor Law and also Malthusianism. Our next quotation can be found in Stave 2, when Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Past observe Belle breaking up with the young miser. Their dialogue is as follows. "What idol has displaced you?" he rejoined. "A golden one." Simply put, this dialogue shows us that the mindless pursuit of wealth comes at the cost of love, family and happiness. This is demonstrated by the figurative language, "a golden one," meaning a golden idol in Belle's dialogue, as it shows that she believes that Scrooge has prioritised financial gain over her. Furthermore, the religious connotations of idol imply that money is indeed the most important thing in all of Scrooge's life, showing just how greedy or money obsessed he has grown. It seems then that Dickens is expressing the age-old belief. Money really can't buy you happiness. In fact, the pursuit of money might make it all the harder for you to reach it at all. Our third and final quotation relating to the negative presentation of wealth in Dickens's novella comes from the third stave, particularly in the part where Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present witness the hustle and bustle of Christmas Day. After a moment's reflection, Scrooge asserts to the spirit, "You would deprive them of their means of dining every 7th day, often the only day on which they could be said to dine at all, wouldn't you?" Now after this, the spirit seems to get quite frustrated, angry even, at Scrooge. Now all of this seems a bit random and confusing, and I must admit that this is a part of the story that even I find tricky to understand. It turns out that a bit more context is required in order for us to understand this dialogue. In the Victorian era, bakers were not allowed to bake bread on Sundays, seen as the 7th day, or on Christmas Day. But the thing is, they still needed to keep their ovens warm so that they could effectively bake on Mondays and on Boxing Day. With their ovens already warm, bakers would cook meat joints, pies and whatnot for the poor, who would not have had their own ovens at home. This way, the poor would still be able to eat properly on Sundays, traditionally a day off work, and for those who are lucky enough to not be working, on Christmas Day as well. However, throughout the 1830s, a politician called Sir Andrew Agnew tried to introduce a Sunday Observance Bill that would have forced bakers and other businesses to completely close on Sundays and presumably Christmas Day as well, so that people may instead fully worship the Christian God. This would not have had a large impact on the wealthy, who would have been able to relax in their comfortable, well-equipped homes and cooked for themselves, or, if they had them, got their servants to do it for them. For the poor, though, this would have denied them the ability to eat a proper cooked dinner on Sundays. All of this was done in the name of religion, which is why Scrooge asserts that the spirit wants this to happen, since it is the ghost of Christmas present, and so has, in theory, religious connections. All of this is to say then that Scrooge's assertion that the spirit desires bakeries and other businesses to be fully closed on Sundays is a reference to the attempts made by wealthy politicians to deprive the poor of warm Sunday and probably Christmas dinners. Rather than doing what they could to support the impoverished, it seems that the powerful and wealthy in the Victorian times made attempts, inadvertently or otherwise, to make the lives of the poor all the more difficult. So if that's how wealth has been presented negatively in Dickens's tale, how has it been presented positively? Our next three quotations will focus on this. Our first quotation for this section comes from stave 1 of the novella, when Scrooge is in dialogue with the charity representative. This individual states, "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time." Now, by including this character in his story, Dickens acknowledges the charitable endeavours made by the wealthy in the Victorian era. The charity representative is presented positively, I think, because he politely refers to Scrooge using the formal Mr. Scrooge, whereas his suggestion that slight provision from the rich will compensate for the great suffering of the poor shows a degree of social responsibility and social consciousness, thanks to the juxtaposition between slight and greatly. However, I do also wonder if the acknowledgement of charities presents, in a sort of subtle way, a negative aspect of poverty. After all, if these charities are necessary, doesn't that suggest that the poverty problem is both sizable and also not dealt with by those with power? Our second quotation, focusing on positive presentations of wealth, comes from stave 2. More precisely, it can be found in the Ghost of Christmas Past's dialogue once it and Scrooge have witnessed the party thrown by Fezziwig, Scrooge's former employer. The spirit remarks, "A small matter to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps." Now this dialogue shows that small acts of generosity, so using one's wealth on others, is capable of bringing great happiness to other people. This is evident because the spirit calls Fezziwig's generosity a, quote, small matter, downplaying its financial impact on the business owner's wealth. Indeed, moments later, the spirit states that Fezziwig spent a few pounds on the party, perhaps 3 or 4, which amounts to about 200 quid in today's money, a relatively small sum of money. And the spirit knows this because it further downplays the cost, using but before a few pounds to suggest that the sum is insignificant for Fezziwig. This small expense has had an enormous effect though, because it has made the revellers so full of gratitude. The intensifying phrase "so full" implies that the partygoers are immensely appreciative of Fezziwig's efforts, therefore showing that wealth can indeed be positive if it is used for the benefit of others, rather than being pointlessly hoarded and amassed. Our final quotation, looking at the positive presentation of wealth in A Christmas Carol, comes from the final stave. Upon waking up giddy, Scrooge speaks to a boy out on the street and asks him if he is familiar with "Not the little prize turkey, the big one," at the poulterer's shop. The turkey, I'm sure you know, is something Scrooge wants to send to the Cratchit family, a gesture that you will know is doubly generous if you've watched my video about the presentation of Christmas in this novella. Thinking about wealth and poverty then, I suggest that Scrooge's gesture shows that the miser has learned from the spirits and has decided to use his wealth to bring happiness to others. He is finally using his sizable fortune to address the plights of poverty. That's my analysis of wealth, both its good and bad sides, over for now. But what about wealth's opposite, poverty? What can we say about that? Well, let's have a think about the negative presentations of poverty in the novella. The first negative presentation of poverty that I would like to think about comes in stave 3, when Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present observe the Cratchits. After seeing the weak and feeble Tiny Tim, Scrooge asks if the boy will die, to which the spirit responds, "I see a vacant seat. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." How does this present poverty negatively, I hear you cry? Well, simply put, I think this quotation explicitly connects poverty with death, thanks to the spirit's blunt "will die." Because of their poor living conditions, poor diets, harsh working conditions, and inability to access healthcare, remember there was no NHS in 1843, the impoverished often died to illnesses or diseases that could have been remedied. In making Tiny Tim's death seem inevitable, as long as his living conditions are not altered, that is, Dickens offers his readers, who would have been mostly middle and upper class, a stark insight into the harsh realities of poverty. Our next quotation occurs at the end of stave 3, in the scene with ignorance and want. In introducing them, the Ghost of Christmas Present explains, "This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written, which is doom." Now, I argue that this pretty hyperbolic introduction of ignorance and want, hyperbolic because of the extremely negative connotations of the word doom, creates an emphatic statement about the perils of poverty. As I explained in my video about ignorance and want, it isn't clear if this doom applies only to ignorance and want themselves, the impoverished working class at large that they come to represent, or all of humanity. But despite this ambiguity, I think it is pretty clear that Dickens is suggesting that ignorance and want, two results of extreme poverty, should be avoided. Society needs to get to a place where these entities are not created in the first place. Our final quotation, looking at the negative presentation of poverty, comes in stave 4, once Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come have witnessed old Joe and the three thieves discussing the items that have been stolen from the dead man's house. We of course know that this dead man is in fact Scrooge, but the miser does not know this yet. At the end of the lengthy scene in which we find out exactly what the thieves have stolen from the dead man, Scrooge's response to all of this is described in the narration. We learn that Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. As they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp, he viewed them with a detestation and disgust, which could hardly have been greater. I argue that Scrooge's reaction to old Joe and the three thieves shows not only how the wealthy view the poor, but also offers a reminder that impoverished conditions breed desperation, which in turn can lead to criminality. The reason why I say that Scrooge's reaction shows how the wealthy viewed the poor in the Victorian times is because Scrooge listens to their dialogue in horror and views them with detestation and disgust that could hardly have been higher, creating an overwhelmingly negative semantic field that recalls the negative views that the wealthy had of the poor, that they were too lazy or drunk to work. However, it is also likely that Scrooge is so repulsed by what he has seen because it was in fact illegal. Stealing things, even if from a dead man, is criminal behaviour of the sort that Scrooge, a wealthy character, would likely not have witnessed before. Seeing these characters openly discuss their criminal activities then would have reminded Scrooge, and Dickens's readers of course, that poverty causes immense desperation, which itself can lead to criminal behaviour. in presenting something so shocking, whilst also presenting it as a consequence of poverty. It appears that Dickens is once again trying to suggest that poverty is symptomatic of an inherently failing society, and that correcting it, getting rid of it even, is of the utmost importance. And finally, now that we have considered the good and bad presentation of wealth and the negative presentations of poverty, it is time for us to look at how poverty might be presented in a positive light. I'll tell you now that all of these quotations will focus on one group of characters in particular, the Cratchits. Our first quotation that looks at the positive presentation of poverty comes from Stave 3. In fact, I'll tell you now, they all do. This one in particular looks at the description of Mrs. Cratchit. She is described as dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons. Now, this description of Mrs. Cratchit depicts the impoverished as being resourceful, because she wears a twice-turned gown that is brave in ribbons, meaning that Mrs. Cratchit has adapted, altered and accessorised her clothing in order to keep it fresh, rather than buying new clothes, which she presumably would not have been able to afford. Now, this resourcefulness, to me at least, runs contrary to the lazy tag that the wealthy applied to the poor, because going through the effort of turning out one's clothes, using ribbons to hide stains and bare patches, and generally making do with what one has, sounds like an awful lot of hard work, whereas just buying new clothes, which is what the wealthy would have done of course, is actually the quick, easy and ultimately lazy option. Secondly, let's look at how the Cratchit family, particularly their children, respond to their Christmas dinner. When the goose is brought out, we learn such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon. As I have said elsewhere, the fact that the Cratchits are eating goose, and a small one at that, highlights their immense poverty. But the noun bustle and alliterative phrase feathered phenomenon reveals that the family are incredibly grateful for the little that they do have. We do not witness a poor family who complain, who moan, who whinge or sulk about the quality of their lives, but instead remain humble and appreciative and, well, just glad. There's something very endearing about this response, and you can't help but feel warmly towards the Cratchits at this point. It still remains that poverty is a terrible thing, but by presenting the characters who live in poverty in a positive light, Dickens's suggestion that more should be done to support the impoverished is made all the more compelling. I mean, after all, if the Cratchits were really awful characters, nobody would care and nobody would want to do anything about it, would they? And finally, let's have a look at some of Tiny Tim's dialogue, which is of course, "God bless us, everyone." Simply put, this shows us that despite his illness, which is of course itself a consequence of his family's poverty, Tiny Tim is presented as being a kind and thoughtful person with strong Christian values, because he asks God not only to bless him and his family, as seen in Us, but all of humanity also, as seen in everyone. Just as with his family's reaction to their meagre goose dinner, this quotation shows that as much as living in poverty is terrible, it does not necessarily mean that the people living in it are terrible. And by appealing to his readership's Christian sensibilities, Dickens's suggestion that more should be done to support the poor is made all the more compelling once again. Okay then, so that is my quotation analysis complete, but don't close the video just yet. There's plenty of other useful things to come. For instance, a summary. If we wanted to summarise how Dickens has made use of the theme of wealth and poverty in his story, what could we say? Well, we could say, appalled by what he saw around him in contemporary society, Dickens criticises the financial inequality that abounded in the Victorian times in his novella. The covetous selfishness of the wealthy drives the impoverished to criminal activity, leads them to death, or results in their doom. Hope can be found in the instances of wealthy characters being generous, though, which is exemplified by Scrooge's gesture to the Cratchit family at the story's end. That is where Dickens's moralistic message can be found. Simply put, the wealthy must do more to support the poor. Now, not going to brag, I think this is quite a strong summary for a number of reasons. First of all, it's got some context in there, such as the idea that there was great financial inequality in the Victorian era. Secondly, it's got an evaluative verb in it, criticises, which shows high-level thinking and encourages more insightful analysis. Thirdly, it's got loads of great vocabulary in there, such as covetous, impoverished, and moralistic. Additionally, it provides an overview of the theme at large, which shows great knowledge of the text, whilst also offering smaller comments that could themselves prompt larger analytical paragraphs. And finally, it includes a comment about Dickens's intentions as well. Lovely stuff. Now, if you think that this summary is going to be useful for you to write down, now is your time to pause the video and do so, because we're about to move on and think about some next steps that you could take. So what are those next steps then? Well, firstly, I've got a question for you. Out of those 4 quadrants that we saw in this video, so wealth is bad, wealth is good, poverty is bad, and poverty is positive, which one do you think is most important to Dickens's ability to convey his moralistic message, and why? Now, this might just be something that you think about and jot down some notes for. It might be something you decide to use to prompt a mind map or some flashcards. Or, if you really wanted to, it could be something that you use to prompt a short evaluative paragraph, which you are more than welcome to pop down in the comments section. I'm usually pretty good at responding to your work, so if you do take the time to write some analysis down in the comments section, I will make sure to give some informal feedback. Now, if you don't fancy answering that question, which is, fair enough, why not think about some further ideas instead? After all, and here comes that curveball, does wealth and poverty really only relate to ideas to do with money? Or could it be argued that some characters are rich in ways that others are poor? I mean, could we talk about characters being wealthy or poor in terms of how much love they have? Lastly, if you are after more things to help you out with this theme, then I suggest watching my videos about the Cratchit family and ignorance and want, because those will help you to think about poverty much more clearly. Whereas watching my video about family might help you to think about wealth and poverty in terms that are not financial. It's a bit outside the box, I know, but I am certain that it is possible to write an incredibly convincing essay that suggests that Scrooge is poor, whereas the Cratchits are wealthy. Furthermore, please do have a look at the bibliography that I have put in the video description. There's loads of links there to websites that will give you a more solid understanding of the contextual ideas that are super relevant to this theme, which can only help you to secure those top grades. Okay. That was a very detailed video, so well done for making it all the way through, because that is my discussion of the theme of wealth and poverty in A Christmas Carol complete. Genuinely, I hope it has helped you out in some way, either because you are revising for exams, studying A Christmas Carol for the first time, or just otherwise have some sort of interest in Dickens's story. If this video has been helpful and you would like to make your appreciation known, a like, comment, subscription or share would be immensely appreciated. It helps me out loads and also helps me to help even more learners, and so it's actually a win-win situation for everyone. Anyway, as ever, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. In his story then, Dickens shows just how complex wealth and poverty are then.
selfish wealth is bad, but generous wealth is good. And whereas poverty itself is absolutely terrible, the people living in poverty are not. All of this is to say that Dickens showed just how unjust financial inequality was in the Victorian era, and that the wealthy should definitely use their vast resources to help out those who are much less fortunate.